A woman spends 38 years married to a man who seems calm, put together, impossible to read. Only after he is gone does she realize the silence was never shyness. It was a system somewhere else. A teenager stares straight ahead in the passenger seat, refusing to react to anything because reacting would be embarrassing. Both of them look exactly the same from the outside. Detached, unbothered, ice cold. But one of them is a scared person wearing armor, and the other is a predator wearing camouflage. And if you can't tell the difference, you will either abandon someone who needed patience or stay with someone who is quietly dismantling your reality. In a moment, you will learn why actual narcissistic personality disorder affects only a tiny fraction of the population, despite what the internet wants you to believe. You will hear how one calm man convinced doctors and police that his partner was the crazy one. And you will get 5 concrete tests to separate someone who is simply terrified to care from someone who is actively manipulating you. Because the line between desperate self-protection and calculated psychological manipulation is incredibly blurry. From the outside, the two can look virtually identical. And that is exactly why so many people find themselves paralyzed trying to navigate these relationships. Right now, millions of people are furiously Googling how to act they just do not care. Nonchalance has basically become the ultimate social currency. But if you are on the receiving end of that icy, stone-faced detachment from a partner, a close friend, or even a teenager in your house, you are likely asking yourself a much darker question. You pour your heart out and you just get a shrug, and you are left spinning, trying to figure out what is actually going on. Are they just trying to look cool, wearing this detachment like a shield to protect their own fragile feelings? Or, and this is the real fear, are you staring into the face of a covert narcissist? Getting this distinction wrong has a cost in both directions. When we mislabel these behaviors, we do not just create confusion. We end up watering down the stark reality for survivors of actual abuse, while at the same time stigmatizing people who are just quietly struggling to cope with an overwhelming world. So the best place to start is the current epidemic of the shrug. Social media has turned nonchalance into a full-blown lifestyle brand. There was recently a staggering 241% spike in just 1 month of people searching for how to be nonchalant. It is an incredible paradox. Putting intense effort and research into figuring out how to look like you are not putting in any effort at all, and you see this performative apathy playing out everywhere in real time now. There are viral videos that perfectly capture the dynamic. In one of them, a mom is in the driver's seat of her car, enthusiastically belting out a Blink-182 song. She is having a great time, and her teenage son is in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead like a gargoyle. He does not flinch, he does not smile, it is pure, impenetrable stone. In another widely shared video, an affectionate mom is shouting "I love you" at her daughter over and over, trying to break through this wall of chill. The daughter finally snaps. But without breaking her monotone, she just yells back, "I love you too." It is funny on the surface, but when you look past the humor, you find a very specific underlying motivation. Educators and mental health experts observe that constructing this wall really boils down to an emotional shortcut. It is a defense. It is fundamentally a coping mechanism for an environment that feels totally unpredictable, a coping mechanism for being continuously let down. People openly admit that if they have been disappointed by relationships, friendships, or even just the state of the world over and over, they start to believe they are going to get hurt no matter what. So they preemptively detach. If you do not care, getting hurt does not sting. It also acts as a strong defense against embarrassment, the fear of being cringe. A high school teacher noted in a school newspaper that students will literally sit at the back of the class and refuse to raise their hands, not because they do not know the answer, but because the very act of caring about the class is seen as cringe. That fear of being cringe is a powerful behavioral driver right now. It is essentially emotional suppression masquerading as empowerment. People want to feel in control, and displaying emotion, showing that something actually affects you, feels like giving up that control to someone else. It is like wearing heavy emotional armor. It does not mean there is nobody underneath that suit. It does not mean they lack thoughts or deep feelings. It just means they are terrified of getting pierced. But when you wear that heavy armor every single day, at what point does it start to crush the person inside? The human nervous system just is not designed to suppress emotion indefinitely. It has to go somewhere. What begins as a conscious defense mechanism very quickly becomes a rigid physiological trap. When you hide your real feelings consistently, you do not just pull away from your friends and family. You actually start to disconnect from your own internal signals. Medical and mental health experts warn that this extreme nonchalance often masks and actively worsens deep anxiety and depression. You essentially practice not caring so much that you forget how to process your own joy or sadness. And that leads to a deep isolation. You start seeing warning signs, a sudden drop in grades, pulling away from loved ones, spending excessive time alone, refusing help, even when it is offered in a completely safe space. The person creates a very lonely, restricted existence, all just to maintain the illusion of being unbothered. So that is one side of it. Nonchalance is armor to protect oneself. It is a shield for a scared kid or a burned data just trying to survive without getting embarrassed or heartbroken again. But the danger of this camouflage is best understood when you look at how it can be weaponized. What happens when that exact same detached, icy armor is used not to protect a scared person, but to hide a demanding, fragile, and manipulative ego? This is where the second word comes in, narcissist, specifically actual narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD. And before diagnosing the people around you, we really have to ground this in clinical reality, because the internet has severely distorted the prevalence of this disorder. Everyone uses the word now. But real diagnosable narcissistic personality disorder only affects about 0.5% to 6.2% of the population, which completely flies in the face of what you see online. If you scroll through relationship advice for 5 minutes, you would think half the population has NPD. Every bad ex who did not text back, every demanding boss, every person who cuts you off in traffic gets slapped with this label. And clinical psychologists are pushing back against this trend because calling someone a narcissist just because they are occasionally selfish or post too many selfies waters down the devastating reality of the actual disorder. NPD is much deeper. It is a deep, inflexible, lifelong pattern of behavior that severely impairs a person's ability to function in healthy relationships. The official medical signs in the DSM-5, the diagnostic manual used by psychiatrists, lay out very specific criteria: a grandiose sense of self-importance, a need for constant, endless praise, extreme entitlement, a willingness to exploit and take advantage of other people to get what they want, and crucially, a fundamental lack of empathy. They simply cannot or will not recognize or care about the feelings and needs of others. But here is a strange paradox. They demand the spotlight and act superior. Yet data from institutions like the Mayo Clinic suggests they're completely terrified of the slightest criticism. Behind this mask of extreme confidence, people with NPD harbor secret feelings of intense shame, vulnerability, and a paralyzing fear of being exposed as a fraud. It is almost like the massive ego is just a smokescreen. Think of a giant shiny balloon. From the outside, it looks huge and impressive, taking up all the space in the room, but it is actually just full of thin air. And one tiny pinprick of criticism, one little comment that challenges their superiority, causes it to violently pop. Because the skin of that balloon is so thin, they spend all their energy making sure no one gets close enough to see it. And when it pops, you do not get a healthy human reaction like sadness or self-reflection. You get what clinicians call narcissistic rage. They react with disproportionate anger, seek revenge, or completely flip the script to play the ultimate victim. But if they are so loud and grandiose, why do nonchalance and narcissism get confused? To understand that, we have to look beyond the loud, grandiose narcissist that everyone pictures. We have to look at the covert or vulnerable narcissist. This is the twilight zone where the two concepts collide, because from the outside, the covert narcissist looks exactly like the TikTok nonchalant kid. They are quiet, they are detached, they might even seem shy or socially anxious. They listen apathetically, they act bored. But behind closed doors, it is a completely different story. They use the silent treatment not out of social anxiety, but as a primary weapon of control. A nonchalant kid might act detached for a semester to survive high school. A covert narcissist will use this exact same detachment to systematically dismantle a partner's reality over decades. The timeline is what makes the camouflage so insidious. Consider a 14-year marriage. A woman married a man who started out incredibly charming, calling her his princess. It was a classic example of love bombing. It did not last. Within 2 weeks of the wedding, the mask slipped. She asked to go get a coffee, and he aggressively swore at her. Over the next 14 years, he did not just stay detached. He used his icy demeanor as a baseline to excuse active cruelty. The mechanism keeping a victim trapped in a situation like that is something called intermittent reinforcement. It is the same psychology that makes a slot machine so addictive. The abuser is mostly cold and detached, but occasionally, unpredictably, they drop a breadcrumb of affection or act like that charming person from the beginning. The victim's brain gets flooded with dopamine during those rare good moments, keeping them hooked, always hoping the cruelty will end. In this specific case, he was completely detached when she was pregnant. And even after she tragically lost the baby, it was not awkwardness with grief. It was a total lack of empathy because the tragedy did not center around him. He cheated repeatedly, publicly threw food at her in a restaurant and forced her to work in his business with no pay and no holidays. She described living on eggshells for over a decade, never knowing what would trigger his rage. And that control can span an entire lifetime, maintained almost entirely through a calm, chilling detachment. There is another account of a woman married for 38 years to a covert narcissist. To the outside world, to their neighbors and friends, he was considered the best person in the world. He seemed calm, put together, aloof but polite. But inside the house, he controlled everything through quiet intimidation. What she wore, how she looked, what she cooked, what she was allowed to say. He effectively created a prison using nothing but silence and disapproval. After he passed away, she realized she had been so entirely controlled that she had no basic life skills. She felt exactly like the frightened 18-year-old child she had been on her wedding day, because the detachment was a calculated tool to keep her isolated and dependent. Here is where it gets really interesting. The nonchalant person uses silence because they are scared. The narcissist uses silence as a weapon to control you and watch you squirm. The psychological manipulation reaches its peak when the abuser weaponizes their own calmness against the victim. There is one deeply disturbing account of a woman whose partner was so seemingly calm and so quietly manipulative that he successfully convinced doctors and police that she was the crazy one. That is the darkest form of gaslighting. He would push her to the absolute brink in private, and then, when she finally snapped and yelled out of pure frustration, he would point at her reaction and say, "Look at her violent behavior." She ended up medicated on Valium for 25 years because this calm, detached man convinced the world she was unhinged. Psychologists refer to this as reactive abuse. The abuser instigates an intense situation using a calm, sometimes even pitiful delivery. They cut you down with a carefully placed, cruel phrase. And when you react with justifiable, explosive anger, they sit back with a nonchalant expression and say, "See, you are out of control." Outsiders only see the victim yelling and the abuser looking calm, so they side with the abuser, which makes it incredibly urgent to know how to spot the difference before it is too late. The shield looks identical, but the person operating it has an entirely different agenda. So how can you tell them apart? You can rely on specific behavioral patterns. While only a clinical professional can diagnose a personality disorder, you can absolutely recognize the patterns of behavior that dictate whether a relationship is safe or toxic. Here are the 5 definitive tests you can apply to the icy, detached person in your life. Test number 1, the empathy test. When you hurt, do they show up? This is foundational to human connection. If you are in genuine pain, maybe you lost your job or are dealing with a family crisis, a nonchalant person will eventually drop the act. They might be incredibly awkward about it, but they will try. They might not offer perfect poetic comfort, but their actions will show up for you. A covert narcissist will do one of two things: completely dismiss your pain as an inconvenience to their schedule, or hijack the situation to make your tragedy entirely about how it affects them. Test number 2, the criticism test. This is where we bring the pinprick to that shiny balloon. What happens when you gently tell them that something they did hurt your feelings? A nonchalant person might initially get a little defensive. Nobody likes criticism, but ultimately their empathy kicks in. They will say, "I am sorry, I did not mean to do that," and adjust their behavior. A covert narcissist experiences criticism as a severe psychological injury. They will react with an icy, punishing rage. They will deploy the silent treatment for days, or they will so thoroughly flip the script and play the victim that by the end of the conversation, you find yourself apologizing to them for being bothered in the first place. That subtle blame shifting is how the gaslighting takes root. Test number 3, the pattern test. Is it a one-off bad mood or a years-long fixed pattern? Because everyone can be selfish. Everyone has bad days where they are cold, detached, or overwhelmed. The defining factor is the timeline and the scope. A personality disorder like NPD is a fixed, rigid pattern of behavior that spans across years, decades, and multiple different relationships and environments. It is the core architecture of how they interact with the world, not just a passing mood. Test number 4, the change test. Can they genuinely admit fault? Is not it possible for a narcissist to just go to therapy and learn better behaviors? It is a completely different mechanism. With NPD, the disorder itself actively prevents the cure. In psychology, behaviors that feel natural and protective to a person are called egosyntonic. The narcissist's false grandiose self is their only defense against their deep shame. To genuinely admit fault, to take accountability and change, requires them to acknowledge that they are flawed, that threatens their entire fragile self-image. Admitting they are the problem would pop the balloon. So their brain's defense mechanism simply will not allow them to do the deep self-reflection required for therapy to work. But a nonchalant person is just stuck in a bad habit of hiding. Once they feel safe, they can absolutely adapt and change 100%. And finally, test number 5. Who benefits? This strips away all the psychology and looks at the raw outcome. Nonchalance is ultimately designed to protect the person acting it. They are hoarding their emotional resources to shield themselves. Narcissism, on the other hand, is designed to extract emotional resources. It feeds off the people around them. If their so-called chill behavior is actively draining your energy, keeping you constantly guessing and making you feel crazy while they sit back and watch the chaos they caused, you are dealing with manipulation, not nonchalance. Does the armor protect them, or does it consume you? That is the question that settles it. And thankfully, we are starting to see a cultural exhaustion with all of this detachment. People are getting tired of the emotional games. There is a massive counter-movement rising up against nonchalance right now. It is being labelled the rise of chalance. Chalance meaning caring out loud. There has been a reported jump of over 200% in people wanting to embrace being chalant. Texting back right away instead of waiting 3 hours to look busy. Saying "I like you" without feeling intense shame. Refusing to play the miserable game of who can care the least in the modern dating scene. Because people are collectively realising that the old cool girl or unbothered guy script is just a one-way ticket to absolute isolation. There is a fascinating statistic from a Hinge dating report that perfectly captures the friction we are all experiencing. They found that 52% of daters feel intensely embarrassed after they open up emotionally to someone. More than half the population feels vulnerable and literally cringes at their own honesty. Which explains exactly why the search for how to be nonchalant spiked 241%. Everyone is terrified of looking foolish. But here is the brilliant twist. In that same dataset, only 19% of people actually mind when someone else opens up to them. So the vast majority of people are completely fine with vulnerability when they receive it, but we are all collectively terrified of offering it. We are terrified of a ghost. We are hoarding our emotions because we fear being judged for caring. But the truth is, the vast majority of humans crave deep vulnerability. We want connection. We want you to care out loud. We are stubbornly hiding our feelings from the exact people who are desperately hoping we will show them. So what is the ultimate takeaway? First, psychological labels are tools for understanding behavior, not weapons to win internet arguments or dismiss an ex. Slapping the word narcissist onto everyone who ghosts you diminishes the devastating reality of true narcissistic abuse. Being calm is fine. Needing space to process your feelings is fine. But using silence to punish people and engineering situations to feed your own ego at someone else's expense is abuse. If you are listening to this and recognizing the darker signs, if you are constantly walking on eggshells, if your reality is routinely denied through reactive abuse, if you are being punished with silence by someone who never admits fault, you need to take steps to protect yourself. Document things to anchor your reality against gaslighting. Set incredibly firm boundaries. Seek professional support. You cannot expect empathy from someone whose psychological makeup fundamentally lacks the capacity to generate it. But if you realize that you or someone you love is simply wearing the heavy armor of nonchalance because the world feels chaotic and rejection hurts, you have a different kind of work to do. Caring is not cringe. It is the most fundamental requirement of the human experience. Drop the shield. And here is something else to mull over. A deeper question about where we are heading as a culture. We know that social media algorithms thrive on flat, unbothered, easily digestible content, and they actively punish nuance and deep emotional engagement. If we spend hours every day interacting with a digital world that mathematically rewards apathy and trains us to view caring as embarrassing, are we engineering a society that mimics the very lack of empathy we find so destructive in narcissists? When the algorithm trains the next generation to be perfectly detached, what happens to our collective capacity to connect? Something to think about.